Welcome back to For All Kerbalkind. Last episode, both the Soviets and I performed preliminary crewed lunar orbit flights, mere weeks apart from each other. A Soviet spacecraft managed to reach a fruitful orbit of Mars, we tested Dinosaur suborbitally, and landed Surveyor 1 on the far side of the moon. All the while, Soviet infrastructure is getting scarily capable of beating us in the race to the moon, as our massive moon rockets are just about ready. We'll have to see what we can do to catch up. Our main focus now is money and time. We have plenty of missions planned in order to get us money to compensate for spending pretty much every fund I have on the final R&D building upgrade. This will translate to half a year of time saved for our coming lunar landing, and still leaves us with plenty of time to complete various contracts in order to actually be able to afford the massive Saturn V rocket launches. To compensate a little bit for this, we will grab the Mars rover contract and simply worry about completing that much later on. The Wanderer 1 rover continues to wander across the surface of the moon. It was left stationary for quite a time last episode, but we've now moved it further east and plan to continue its journey across the surface, gathering plenty of scientific data as it leaves small wheel marks in a trail everywhere it roams. November 22nd, 1963. In the past few weeks, John F. Kerman has stated before Congress, NASA, and the Astro Foundation his vision of space exploration, a revision of the current race between two major powers of the world. All this time, the Soviets and United States have been locked in a technological and scientific whose rocket is bigger contest, and JFK calls for its demise. His vision would have the Soviet Union join America in the conquest of space, a joint mission to the moon, cancellation of the Saturn V rocket, collaboration that could prove to further cool the Cold War. On the 22nd of November, John F. Kerman is assassinated while riding in a motorcade through Dallas, Texas. Along with him also dies the hope of collaboration between the two nations, at least for the time being. The motive for this act remains shrouded in mystery. Could it be radical political motivations? The United States viewing a major revision of its moon program as a massive blunder? Someone on either side of the Cold War wishing to egg on the conflict rather than resolve it? One way or another, today's date will live in infamy. However, the new President of the United States, Lyndon B. Kerman, aims to push the Trinity program forward, full speed ahead. December 17th, 1963. Early in the morning, both Gemini 6 and Saturn 1 sit on launch pads off the Texas coast. Launch faculty and crew are used to these back-to-back launches by now, ever since the previous Gemini mission earlier in the year. And this one is much the same. Although back at launch control, more permanent stations have been instated. Today, we aren't launching an orbital rocket stage to ferry Gemini anywhere new. No, today we're launching an orbital laboratory, first of its kind, intended to both short-term host the crew of Gemini for months at a time, theoretically, with the promise of plenty of legroom, and long-term to be serviced and resupplied via the Dinosaur spacecraft. For its duration, it will serve to keep both of those programs alive, as Trinity's primary focus will be to bring Kerbonauts to the moon. The sun rises over the Gulf of Mexico as the KIV Research Station lifts from the surface. At 2 minutes and 39 seconds, stage separation occurred successfully. Although telemetry did suggest an anomaly, one of the second stage engines did not report startup, which could be the side effect of many problems, though the other 5 engines report full power, and gimbals struggling to maintain desired attitude, though doing so successfully. The options are shut off the opposing engine to recenter thrust and risk overburning or not reaching orbit, or the better option, reattempt to light the engine. This luckily proved successful, and the second stage is able to continue its flight. Ten and a half minutes from liftoff, and the KIV Research Station has reached a nominal orbit of the Earth, 324 by 320 kilometers. All 6 engines of the Cattern stage are fully disabled, gimbals locked, control thrusters maintained a forward-facing attitude, and idle systems are checked and monitored by ground control. The Orbital Outpost's large solar panels are now free to deploy in orbit, ensuring enough power for all life support systems to be activated tomorrow, and indicator lights are turned on. During the liftoff, both the fore and payload fairing, as well as the solar panel covers, struck the fuel tank after jettison. Telemetry does not indicate any problems, but crew will inspect for any damage upon arrival. And speaking of crew, Peter and Eileen have been selected for the first occupants of the KIV station. Although receiving higher doses of radiation on Gemini 3, far more than NASA recommends, the Foundation leave that risk up to the crew themselves, and both unanimously agree they would like to be assigned flights, although leaving low Earth orbit is out of the question. So, for the greater part of 1963, they have been an integral part in the KIV station's internal design, and have been patiently waiting for this day to come. So, for 23 hours, the station systems still appear go, and the Titan II rocket appears the same. Gemini 6 is go for liftoff. All seems well, until stage separation. Second stage ignition triggers moments too soon, and the crew feel a massive jolt as the spacecraft begins to rotate rapidly. This is monitored by panicking flight control below, as crew troubleshoot any possible problems, ready to abort at any moment. It's determined explosive bolts did not fully separate the interstage structure between Titan II's 2 stages, which is now interfering with the engine's ability to gimbal, likely a side effect of the jolting separation. Moments before calling for an abort, the structure releases on its own somehow, flying free for Kraken only knows what. Peter and Eileen report the vehicle's roll rate decreasing, and the vehicle is once again aligned. It is not yet clear what other problems there may be with this particular launch vehicle, but rapid spin aside, Gemini 6 remains go for orbit. Approaching second stage burnout, the crew of Gemini 6 receive another warning. It appears the vehicle is underperforming and will not quite place Gemini into orbit. Instructed to ready the OMS thrusters for immediate firing, they will have to burn like crazy to keep from falling into the atmosphere uncontrolled. Upon separation, it is abundantly clear the Titan II rocket did indeed underperform, either due to the separation trouble earlier or another problem in engineering, none of which is our concern right now. Gemini 6 is on a collision course with Earth and would like to very much remain in orbit. This vehicle is only equipped with the usual 2 thrusters, as this event was not anticipated. It did not have any time to wait, falling from 250 kilometers and fast, and with a fairly low perigee that they need to raise. They will have to burn almost vertically to fight gravity for over 10 minutes, and this long-duration burn will waste the majority of their on-orbit fuel, and will likely result in failure of the mission after all. However, it will allow the crew to deorbit and re-enter to a desired recovery location closer to the United States. Everyone monitors telemetry, crunches numbers, and holds their breath as Peter and Eileen burn like hell. 25 minutes from liftoff, Gemini 6 is in orbit of the Earth and terribly low on fuel. Peter and Eileen are instructed to refrain from using attitude thrusters at all costs, instead letting their two-seater tumble a bit in orbit while everyone goes over their options. There is of course the obvious big red abort button on everyone's mind, but despite the situation, nobody wants to pull that trigger. Again, the choice is left to the crew. Whatever they decide, they have the support of flight. It seems like there may be just enough fuel, if sparingly used, to still rendezvous with the station, however unlikely. Or they could go home and try again with Gemini 7, after Chitin 2 is thoroughly examined to determine the causes of failure. This choice is thought over for several hours, until finally a decision is made 10 hours into the flight. Gemini 6 will go for rendezvous regardless. The spacecraft appears fine, and fuel might be able to be used sparingly. And so the quest for rendezvous begins, starting with a 30 meters per second burn 12 hours from liftoff. Several orbits and maneuvers later, and the ground control gives the crew of Gemini 6 the bad news. There simply isn't enough fuel on board to rendezvous. 2 maneuvers from reaching the station, the mission is aborted. Gemini 6 has to burn for home, tail between their legs, with the Chitin 2 to blame. Reaching the appropriate time to burn for home, all 4 retro rockets suddenly fire at once, while the spacecraft is not yet in the proper attitude. This catches everyone off guard as Peter overrides automatic attitude to swing the spacecraft over as fast as possible. Burning in the wrong direction would strand the crew in orbit for very, very short rest of their lives. Even bringing Gemini back to retrograde attitude, it wasn't fast enough. The burn has left them in orbit, albeit a shallower orbit than before, but still shy of the atmosphere. The crew, however, waste no time pondering this. They are determined to come back home. Eileen has been in a similar situation before, albeit not as urgent. March of 1960, she performed what she called the seesaw maneuver, using the forward thruster pack on a Mercury spacecraft to raise its orbit slightly. Now Gemini 6 must do the same to lower their orbit, or else they won't make it home at all. The maneuver nauseatingly brings Peter and Eileen to the proper entry trajectory, although one very scary problem remains. It has used the majority of the entry pack fuel to do so. This will have to be sparingly used during entry, although once below the Kármán line, the atmosphere should keep the spacecraft relatively stable on its own. 3 days from liftoff, the 0.05 G light is illuminated, and the crew begin to feel the effects of entering the atmosphere. Despite a mission full of failures and mishaps, no problems occur during re-entry. Fuel is used minimally in the RCS pack, and a small amount of it remains as the parachutes deploy on time. The only mishap of this entry, however, is the landing zone. The United States Navy quickly dispatches recovery teams to the southeastern coast of Cuba, and the new president, Lyndon B. Kerman, does his best to smooth over the diplomatic incidents simultaneously. Recent relations between Cuba and the United States are shaky, especially after the missile crisis. However, diplomacy aside, the crew are recovered and are definitely rethinking their decision to return to flight. But at least this way, they'll be home for the holidays. Well, that mission was an absolute disaster. We are replacing the Chitin 2 with the Chitin 3, which will have more performance and reliability, hopefully. Here, our R&D building is upgrading, which will speed up the last few nodes we need to start building the Cattern 5, finally. But we need a lot of funds in order to do that. So, Gemini 7 will try to rendezvous again in 2 months, and we have plenty of missions to keep us busy in the meantime. Here's hoping that nothing else goes wrong. January 21st, 1964. A familiar sight can be seen in Texas once again. A catless Kentaur is prepped and go for liftoff, carrying Surveyor 2. As with the first Surveyor mission, its destination is again the far side of the moon. In the dead of night, Catless lights its engines and is away. Close to 12 minutes from liftoff, telemetry suggests the Catless Kentaur performed better than expected. We have plenty of fuel to spare for the orbital rocket. Surveyor 2 is in good hands. And now, on to the moon. Surveyor 2 approaches the moon in a peculiar way, backwards, aiming to orbit the moon in a clockwise fashion. This will later provide a daylight approach to its landing site, which doesn't matter for onboard radar, but does for us at home watching. Surveyor will actually pass the lowest point of its orbit without performing a retro burn. Loros B is not in a great position in its orbit to provide comms for the maneuver. So, instead, we will wait a few minutes later for signal with Earth to no longer be blocked by the lunar surface. Given the extra fuel in Kentaur due to the stellar launch, this maneuver still gives Surveyor more fuel than originally expected for its landing. Kentaur fails to light one of its engines when the time comes, however, but an immediate relight later, and the burn is complete. Once in its eccentric orbit, Surveyor 2 is detached before lowering its orbit further and landing. Touching down on the surface, Surveyor 2 shuts its vernier engines down and lurches to the side. Telemetry data streamed back to Earth minutes later states the lander is currently sliding down a crater with an 11-degree slope. It does not appear to be structurally damaging the lander, which seems stable enough for now. Though any experiments able to be run will have to wait for the lander's slide to cease. Regardless though, the mission is complete. Surveyor Farside's landings have been a great success. However, future Surveyor landers will aim to land on the near side of the moon instead. Both the Wanderer and Surveyor missions aim to provide solid data of the lunar surface ahead of crewed landings, and are doing a great job at it so far. Back at Mission Control, we'll be grabbing 2 contracts, a lunar landing contract for Surveyor 3, and the orbital flight with 3 crew contract, as the Trinity spacecraft is about to leave the research queue, and the proper engines shouldn't be too far behind. Back in Wallops, another Catless is go for launch. Just like last year, a communications test satellite is to be launched into a specific orbit. OSCS 5 aims to be the last of this kind, however. with communication network satellites in the early phases of development. Should this flight succeed, the network concept has the green light. Catalyst lifts off from the Virginia coast as the sun hangs high above the Atlantic Ocean. Catalyst performs perfectly, and Agena is ready to complete orbital insertion. Approaching its initial apogee, the Agena has an anomaly, ignition failure. Not to worry, the engine is designed to be able to relight once, and reignition is successful. It seems the engine has not suffered any thrust or specific impulse inefficiencies, and so the mission is still go. OSCS-5 successfully reaches its desired slightly inclined orbit of 1,000 by 6,000 kilometers, roughly. Now back on the ground, this gives us the green light to go ahead with communications network programs. Speaking of, we'll be grabbing that contract now, and I'm not yet sure if we'll use the Wallops or Brownsville sites for it. But considering Texas has its hands full, it will probably be launched from here in Virginia later on. February 23rd, 1964. Peter and Eileen, having recovered from their last flight, have opted to become head of the Kerbonaut training program for the KIV Research Station, rather than fly up again. Two Kerbals have been training with them for this particular mission, Gus and Jim, an engineer and a pilot, and they will be the ones to fly Gemini 7 to the Outpost in orbit, having been idle for quite some time now. It took some elbow grease, but the Gemini spacecraft has been fitted for the Foundation's first launch of a Chiton 3 launch vehicle, having slightly upgraded engines and new livery. Chiton 3 lights up the 700-ton launch complex in the darkness of morning, and Gemini 7 is go. Coming up to stage separation, the point of failure in the previous flight, things go nominally. Smooth separation. Jim and Gus are go for orbit. The Chiton 3 performed perfectly, and the rookie crew of Kerbonauts are in orbit of the Earth, slightly eccentric, but aligned with the station and with plenty of orbital maneuvering capability. No need to burn for orbit with the equipment pack this time around, thank the Kraken. In case a similar situation occurred in the future, all Gemini flights will from now on be equipped with Gemini 5's 4-thruster configuration, rather than the usual 2, as an extra safety precaution. Turns out, the Chiton 3 performed its orbital insertion perfectly, practically a launch to rendezvous right from the get-go, making it extraordinarily easy for Jim and Gus to make it to their destination for sure. All that's needed is 2 small maneuvers to reach the station, and the 2 should arrive at the start of their second orbit around the Earth. First, a 35 meters per second burn to correct their separation error, and second, a 70 meters per second braking burn to come to a stop nearby. From there, it will be mere minutes from sunrise, and station keeping can commence. Approaching from beneath, Gemini 7 observes the indicator lights on the station, blue underneath and flashing red by their intended docking port at the front. For a few minutes, that is all they can see of the K4, until from the darkness, an orange glow emerges in front of them. The sun rises from the horizon and slowly illuminates the outpost in a bright light. Before, they were merely observing numbers from the onboard computer, following instructions from ground control, and being told that they're getting closer. It's not until now, achieving visual observation, actually seeing the station, that it really sinks in. They're home away from home, just floating up here, waiting for them. Jim pilots the spacecraft in a small orbit around the station to verify deployment of the panels, various instruments, and the dinosaur docking bar, as well as recording any observation of damage to the K4 fuel tank from its liftoff. Swinging all the way around, nothing appears to be abnormal or faulty. All seems well. And so, merely 2 hours from liftoff, Gemini 7 is go for docking. The small outpost sits in a dormant state, awaiting crew ingress to verify systems and turn them all on. The modules are unpressurized, with life support inactive. Due to the nature of the Gemini spacecraft, the crew must EVA to reach the hatch just above their ride to and from. Once inside, nitrogen pressurization of the interior begins, which is a very long process, as well as the lithium hydroxide scrubber. Jim and Gus settle in for their long, all-expenses-paid vacation above the Earth, finally able to remove their suits. On board is 2 bedrooms, so to speak. There are more nooks in the wall where one can climb into a strung-up sleeping bag. Of course, plumbing is involved, a system to dispose of waste, and a sort of shower, though in 0G, water is a bit more interesting to deal with. The other Gemini pilots are definitely jealous of these two. The snack cupboards are full, various science experiments are laid out, not to mention getting the bragging rights for breaking crude orbital duration records, all while having the freedom to float around and not just sat in a 2-seat tin can for weeks at a time. Flight control members will be on station for the entire duration of this mission, checking in, monitoring temperatures and pressures of various fuels, performing health checkups on the crew, and so on and so forth, day after day, orbit after orbit. Their time up here is going to be one long big experiment, lasting for at least 1 month's time. But we'll check up on these two later on, when it's time to come back home. March 13th, 1964. Surveyor 3 sits atop another Catless Centaur, awaiting its launch window to the lunar orbital plane. Its mission today will be to land on the near side of the moon this time around, no longer relying on comms relay of Loros B once on the surface. The remaining launches of Surveyor will intend to probe potential landing zones for crew, finalizing our knowledge on what Kerbonauts can expect and train for once they arrive there. Late in the evening, with the moon high above, Surveyor 3 is away. Apart from a momentary shutdown and relight of Kentar's engines, Surveyor 3 is in orbit of the Earth, ready for its journey to the moon. Utilizing Loros B, the Surveyor 3 lowers its paraloon on the near side of the moon in preparation for landing in a large flat area known as the Oceanus Procellarum. The large flat areas on the surface of the moon are ideal for crewed landings, as they don't require a whole lot of maneuvering once you get close to the surface. No avoiding craters or big rots. It should be mostly flat, and so it's important that we get an actual landing probe there to see what it's really like there. During powered descent, one of the 3 vernier engines experiences a transient failure. The other 2 shut down, and all 3 relight automatically with success. Flight Control reading telemetry back on Earth are very worried about this, but there's nothing they can do right now but watch. Just like any uncrewed landing, being so far away with comms delay means it's an automated process and out of their hands. Successfully touching down, a Surveyor is safely on the lunar surface once again. This time with signal beaming directly at Earth, the data and telemetry will flow constantly, not requiring relay from Loros above. The Surveyor program has been a great success thus far, paving the way for crewed landings to come. 7 days from liftoff, Surveyor's surface mission carries on, along with 1 and 2 on the far side. At least 1 more mission is planned for the future, but until then, mission success. March 22nd, 1964. An Earth to Venus transfer window is open, and unlike the previous Mars window that the Soviets were able to utilize and we were not, this one isn't going to slip us by. Sitting on the launch complex in Brownsville is a brand new launch vehicle, the Chiton 3E. Although the Chiton 3 has been utilized with the Gemini 7 mission earlier, the E variant sports 2 massive UA-1205 boosters on either side, as well as the well-known Kentar stage, currently the workhorse of our space program. This launch vehicle outmatches the capability of the Cattern 1, while being cheaper to produce and launch. The downside being a higher risk of failure, but thorough testing has been performed to make sure this vehicle is launch ready. Just as the sun dips beneath the horizon, Chiton 3 lights its boosters and lifts off into the amber sky. The 1205s burn off residual fuel as they are let go to tumble behind the Chiton 3. Lifting off with a crazy high thrust-to-weight ratio, The Titan III soars much higher, much faster on liftoff than any other rockets launched by the Foundation. The launch profile for this particular launch was far less gradual than an efficient launch would have been. However, a steep climb and high altitude turnover is chosen to verify stability of the vehicle at low altitude without putting too much stress on it. Plus, for the payload, we'll have much more fuel than we actually need to complete the mission, so the inefficiency does not matter. The Titan IIIe performs beautifully and reaches a 250-kilometer orbit of the Earth. Its payload now awaits one more burn from the Kentaur stage to send it to Venus. This payload is none other than Markiner 3, a Venus orbiter/lander combo, theoretically. Due to fuel constraints, its chance of success highly depends on the transvenution injection burn coming up. If we arrive at Venus with too much relative velocity, the orbiter portion of the mission will fail, so planning here is key. We also need to account for the position of Venus, the Sun, and the Earth upon arrival. Preferably, the lander would enter the atmosphere during daylight and able to relay comms from the orbiter, which has connection back to the Earth. This will all be fine-tuned by Markiner 3 itself with a small mid-course correction burn. Kentaur's job is to get us to Venus with a desired low relative velocity. Passing by Australia on its first parking orbit, Kentaur lights its engines. Eight seconds before the transvenution injection burn would have completed without issue. Communications with the vehicle is lost. Line of sight with the vehicle is lost as flight control curses, wishing they had placed the parking orbit just a little higher. Lessons learned. But despite this problem, all may not be lost. Yes, the Kentaur has burned through the remainder of its propellant by now, speeding Markiner 3 up by over 1,600 meters per second over. And we won't have comms for several precious minutes. But when communications is re-established, the orbiter will detach, turn around, and burn like hell in the opposite direction. Theoretically, using most of its fuel, we can still reach Venus and attempt to land. That was the plan, at least. Analyzing the trajectory after Markiner 3 completed its correction burn, it seems the probe will not be able to reach Venus after all, flying frustratingly close on its first orbit around the Sun. Calculations show in roughly 13 years, the spacecraft will re-encounter Earth's gravity well once again, at which point a correction burn may be applicable if the craft maintains power for that long, of course. And with hardly any fuel left in the space probe, Markiner 3 has become an expensive loss for the Foundation, and another mission to Venus will be a long ways away. Regardless, Markiner deploys its panels and gets ready to sit in an empty void of interplanetary space, as it will likely remain here for the entirety of its life now. Mission fail. March 24th, 1964. Jim and Gus, aboard the KIV Research Station, have been in space for over 30 days, passing the 2-week record previously set by the lunar orbit missions last year. The payout for this monumental achievement is high, and even higher is the next milestone of staying in space for 60 days. However, as boredom inside the station increases, it's important for the Foundation to bring back the crew at this point in time for psychological and medical examination. Staying in space for long periods of time is, after all, extraordinarily experimental in nature. Jim and Gus suit up, depressurize the airlock portion of the station, and head outside to the Gemini spacecraft, very thankful that it is, in fact, still attached after all this time. Their stay here would be one they will never forget, spending 30 days in zero gravity, monitoring the adaptations their body has made, observing the Earth and a few launches that have happened while they were up here, performing experiments, and even though communications with stations all across the globe were frequent, and they had each other for company, the experience was still one of loneliness. For an entire month, they were stationed away from everything they know and love back on Earth, looking at it from above, so far away, out of touch. Yeah, it's definitely time to come back home. The crew of Gemini 8 will aim to stay aboard the station for 60 days on its next mission, and before they do so, Jim and Gus need to return home safe and sound. Without further incident, the spacecraft readies itself for the harsh but routine entry into the atmosphere, aiming for a splashdown in the South Pacific Ocean. The month-long stay in orbit complete, Jim and Gus are recovered, and the space program receives a wealth of funding for completing its first space station contract. With interplanetary ventures not doing so well, the focus is now split between low Earth orbit and finally heading to the moon, and the race to fly our massive moon rockets is ramping up. But that's going to be all for this episode. As always, to see what the Soviets have been up to, there's a link in the description. Thank you all so much for watching, and peace out.